I spend a lot of time arguing with people about the natural sciences and philosophy. One of the problems, I think, is that many assume that because I'm a classicist and teach the classical liberal arts that I have a sort of bias, an ignorant bias against the modern natural sciences. Uh, the truth is, I actually was a pre-med biology major on the dean's list at Rutgers University, and I worked in a chemistry lab and was planning to go to medical school before I chose to change my focus in life and study the classical liberal arts, classical philosophy, with a focus on Christian theology. So I've never had a bias, especially an ignorant bias, against modern natural science. There are reasons why I object to many of the things taught in the name of science in modern schools and in society in general. There are many things I object to and believe are false, but it's not because of some kind of ignorant bias. In fact, that I will make the argument that when we discuss ancient philosophy and modern science, it's modern society that's actually ignorant in these things. And if we actually go back to read and study the writings of the ancients, we'll find that they're not at all ignorant of anything in terms of the natural world. And I'd even make another argument to support ancient natural philosophy. In modern society, there are many, many people. In fact, I'd argue that the majority of people living in modern society are disconnected from the natural world. They don't know much about animals. They don't know much about plants. They don't know much about the natural world or the heavens because they live in suburbs or in cities. They work in offices. They drive on paved streets, shop at grocery stores. They have very little direct, sustained contact or interaction with the natural world. In the ancient world, that was much less common because it was assumed in most societies, even in our society before the world wars, most people had some direct connection with the natural world, either through farming or hunting or gardening. Different trades and skills often worked directly with nature. Whereas in modern society, there are very, very few people who work directly with nature on a day-to-day basis and have much experiential knowledge of animals or plants, or even weather and seasons and the objects of the heavens and so on. I would argue that the common people, even slaves in the ancient world, had a working knowledge of animals and plants because of the nature of their work living in agricultural society. Whereas modern society, it's most common for very few people to have that experience. And those people are actually rare who are experts in farming and gardening and animals and plants and things like that, or astronomy and so on. So one of the arguments I'll make even to support the ancient philosophers is that if they taught about the natural world, if Aristotle or Plato or Pliny were to publish a book and say things about animals and plants or the heavens, they would be easily proven false by slaves and farmers, by common people who would know by their daily work and experience that what the philosophers taught wasn't founded in nature, but they were just making things up from their schools of philosophy. The philosophers in the ancient world, when it came to natural history and natural philosophy, were much more accountable to the common people than scientists are today. Scientists can say things that almost no one has the opportunity to check or confirm or contradict. There's just no arena for that. There's no competition for a scientific theory or statement. And so I would argue that the ancient philosophers were actually more accountable to observation than modern scientists are. One of the greatest signs of the problem with modern science is that it almost universally teaches false ideas about ancient society and about ancient philosophers. I mean, how many people in modern schools have been taught that people in the ancient world used to think that the world was flat? I know I was taught that in public schools. I was taught that Christopher Columbus was special because he believed that the world was round, whereas everybody else believed the world was flat. And so what was so amazing about Christopher Columbus was that he attempted to sail around the world to prove that it was round and that he wouldn't just sail off the edge of the flat world. I was taught things like that in school as a public school student. And yet, as a classicist, I know and can easily demonstrate that almost no one believed ever that the world was flat. Ptolemaic astronomy teaches in the very first pages of the book that the world is a sphere. Aristotle taught the world was a sphere. Plato taught that the world was a sphere. Pliny teaches that the world is a sphere. So where would that even come from? The idea that people before modern science were so dumb, were so superstitious and ignorant that they believed that the world was just a big flat plate, and if you went off the ocean, you would just sail off and fall off the edge of the world. No one ever believed that. No one ever believed that in the ancient world. And yet you'll be told things like that in modern school classes. And I find time and again that modern science almost depends on its ability to persuade modern people that people who lived before the scientific revolution had no clue how the natural world worked. And we'll hear things like, well, they didn't know anything about penicillin, they didn't know anything about vaccines, they didn't know anything about modern medicine, they didn't know, on and on, all of these assertions about things that people in the ancient world didn't know. And how many people actually go back and study and confirm that these things are true? Sure, there may be a new discovery. Of course there are. Right? Obviously, people in the ancient world didn't have mobile phones. That's obviously something new. But the problem with that idea that they didn't have it because they were dumb, and we have it because we're smart, is simply false. They had entire different systems and ways of handling problems that we have. Or, even better, they had ways of preventing problems that we have. You know, for example, we can brag and boast about how, we have all of these great tools now. For example, diabetics can use little computers and test kits at home to test their blood sugar, and they can then, give themselves insulin shots or take, insulin supplements to help their body regulate their blood sugar and so on. But what we're ignoring is the bigger picture of what's causing diabetes and whether or not that was a problem that the ancient world, that agricultural society, even had to deal with. And if their society didn't have to deal with diabetes, and our society does it make more sense to boast about our cool blood test kits? Or about their society where they prevented and didn't have to deal with diabetes? In our society, we boast that we're able to, or at least we say that we're able to extend life expectancy. So people live longer in modern society. We say that. And I would even object to that statement and say, prove it. Prove that we do. But we talk about life expectancy being made greater by modern science. And yet when we look back to the ancient world, we find that, especially in philosophical circles, like anywhere where people were Platonists or anywhere where people were Catholics, they didn't believe that the end of life was to simply continue in the body for as long as possible, and boasting of the number of days one lived on earth was considered successful. They believed that a man had sort of a natural vocation to fulfill in his life, and once that vocation was fulfilled, he shouldn't see death as anything to avoid, but should just accept the end of life, accept the natural course and the phases of man's life, run his course, and prepare to die well. So when a man faced death in the Middle Ages, he would be concerned with preparing himself spiritually for death so that he could die in peace. He wasn't necessarily even trying to extend his physical life as long as possible. That wouldn't even make any sense, and I would argue that that doesn't even make sense today. And so to pretend that people in the ancient world or in the medieval world were trying to do what we're doing but couldn't figure it out is just not true. It's not true. They had different means of dealing or even preventing the problems that we deal with today, many of which are actually caused by modern society. Another argument that will be made against the past will be, criticism of the medieval world because of the Black Plague. They'll say, look at the Black Plague, like a third of the European population died because of the plague, because they had no idea about vaccines or anything. Well, part of the problem that gets ignored is the Black Plague was primarily caused by urbanization. The disease itself was not a big deal. The problem was that the disease was able to spread so rapidly because of overcrowded cities. I mean, supposedly it came through rats on ships, on merchant ships, coming into busy city ports and then spreading through the people in these crowded cities. We can look back and talk about the plague, but the same thing just happened with COVID. The same thing just happened. And what was the cause? What's the cause of a pandemic? It's not a disease. It's that the society is arranged in such a way that the disease can spread unnaturally quickly through hundreds of thousands or even millions of people. If the disease originated in China, you know what brought it to America? Our high-tech airplanes brought it to America. Our high-tech shipping ports brought it to America. It spread through our urban cities. It spreads through our condensed schools full of kids crammed into single buildings from all over a whole county of space. So the disease spreads through a whole entire community in hours. It spreads at sporting events. It spreads grocery stores. So these ideas that modern society is freeing us from the problems that the ancient world just sort of stupidly and superstitiously lived enslaved to is a fantasy. We just experienced with COVID and saw that a pandemic develops because a disease spreads through modern society, through urbanization, through condensed populations and so on. There's no COVID out here in rural North Carolina. We're not dealing with COVID. And so what's better, to boast of our skyscrapers and mega school buildings and giant football stadiums and all of our high-tech transportation methods, or to go out into the natural world, out into the country where there's fresh air and people are separated and realize that disease can't spread quickly in the world that God actually created? Disease tends to spread quickly where men, by their own engineering, create health disasters and catastrophes. And we see that time and time again. So all that goes to say, modern science, the arrogance of modern science and of modern society in general, what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery, looking back at the past with a sort of arrogant disdain or scoffing, as if they were a bunch of ignorant goons in the ancient world and we're so civilized and modern. If we would actually study, if we would actually learn about the ancient world and about medieval society, rather than just allowing ourselves to believe these false stereotypes, we would find that the opposite was in fact the case. That they didn't have many of the problems that we have today because they avoided them, because they're not natural. They're actually man-made artificial problems that modern society is responsible for. And so what I'd like to challenge Christians to do is join me in a study of Aristotle's work on the history of animals and on Theophrastus's work on the history of plants, which I'm going to be teaching in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy as two courses that I'm titling Classical Biology 1 and Classical Biology 2. Once we get through these two courses, I plan to move on and continue into ancient medicine and other courses in natural philosophy that follow these courses. But we're going to start here with the history of animals by Aristotle and the history of plants by Theophrastus. And what I'd like to show you is that the accusations made against the ancient world are just as false as the statement that people believed the world was flat before Columbus. This modern scientific control of the modern mind and modern education, modern schooling, it depends upon the maintenance of this false narrative that mocks and ridicules ancient people who never existed. It's a straw man argument, and not only do the modern people who hear it not test it, because how would they test it, really? Are they going to go back and study ancient literature? They do this to ignorant people, especially school children. They tell them these things about the ancient world, how everybody was ignorant, how in the Middle Ages, when Catholicism dominated European society, everybody was just ignorant and superstitious. They tell this to children who don't know and can't test to see whether these things are true. And they build this whole false confidence in modern science and modern society on what is demonstrably false. It's a lie that the ancient world was ignorant and superstitious. And we can see that if we actually read the writings of the ancient philosophers. So I'd like to invite you to join me in this study. I'm going to be reading through the books on video, so you can just watch the videos and I'll read through the texts for you. I'll clarify things if there's some vocabulary or references that might need some help explaining. But you'll see, I think you'll be shocked to see how thorough the knowledge of the natural world was among the ancient philosophers, and that all this talk of their ignorance and superstition is a lie. So please join me in this study. I'm going to be offering these courses, as I said, Classical Biology 1 and Classical Biology 2, and I fully intend for them to be used by high school students to satisfy high school science requirements. And I think that as Christians, we need to have some guts. We need to have some confidence in the saints and doctors of the church who believed and taught this very ancient natural philosophy. We have to have some confidence that they weren't a bunch of ignorant fools but that it was true. And that's why men like Thomas Aquinas was perfectly comfortable teaching and speaking about Aristotle's natural philosophy as if it was true, because it is true. And the modern characterization of it is what's actually false. So I invite you not only to study with me, but I challenge you to have some guts as a Christian and take a stand and put some confidence in the wisdom and truthfulness of ancient philosophers and Catholics that lived all through medieval history before the so-called scientific revolution. You'll find access to this course available for free on the Classical Liberal Arts Academy website, and I invite you to join me. Go to the curriculum page, down to philosophy, and you'll see these two courses appearing this spring and into this summer, and I'll start posting lessons and walking through the courses. So I hope that you take me up on this challenge and join me for this study, because like I said, I think you'll be shocked to see that this talk about the ignorance and superstition of the ancient world is simply not true. God bless.